The Mysterious Society of Elite Negroes. Defining this group has evaded us all. Who are they? And what exactly is their purpose? When addressing this group, the most essential element to grasp about identity is understanding the society known as Boule is a predominantly black fraternity. But unlike most fraternities, is non-collegiate. Becoming a member of this fraternity is contingent upon several qualifications. Among the most paramount is excellence of performance in one's field. There are only 5,000 members of Sigma Pi Phi, otherwise known as the Boule. Since the inception of this fraternity in 1904, several dozen of the most well-known so-called black figures of the past century were and are members. It is considered a great honor to become an archon of the Boule. Members range from W.E.B. Du Bois to Colin Powell, and from Kwesi Mfume to Martin Luther King. Contrary to the perceived notoriety, the purpose for this group, however, is perversely sinister. The Miseducation of the Negro is more than just a book by Carter G. Woodson. It has been a philosophy of American colonialism unto this day. And an essential part of this philosophy is using quasi-classically educated Negroes as harbingers for the black masses. Carter G. Woodson being a prime example, whom has been labeled by the establishment father of African American history. Woodson obtained his PhD from Harvard in 1912, where only he and W.E.B. Du Bois were the only black men to achieve such at the time. And at the same point, both of these men would become members of the Boule. One would think by reading Carter G. Woodson's somewhat unapologetically black and African-centric writings that he would have been considered radical and controversial to his white contemporaries. But if it weren't for these so-called white contemporaries, the Carter G. Woodson name would have never seen the eyes of the public. Most of his opposition came from black contemporaries who saw his amalgamation of American blacks with African culture as a conflation of history. As the case may be, the narrative states Carter sought funding in order to continue his endeavors into the establishment of a Negro-centered historical foundation. Inadequate of funding himself, he then turns to the preeminent perpetuators of Negro miseducation for financial backing: the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Julius Rosenwald Foundation. These foundations were created by some of the most unscrupulous businessmen in American history, yet these foundations would fund the spurious new black intellectual movement that culminated in the Harlem Renaissance.
Hearing about Harlem and going to Harlem became exciting, new, different, and people went. They went to a place that others would say, you don't really want to go up there. But in fact, going up there could get you the time of your life. And going into, you also have to remember the early 20s during Prohibition, everyone wants to do just the opposite of what the law says. So of course, that's another reason to go to Harlem. Go against the grain. Women, go against the grain socially. Cut your hair. Wear the short flapper dresses. Go against societal norms. Harlem was that for white America.
The Julius Rosenwald Fund, for example, literally funded most of the renowned artists, musicians, authors, playwrights, and activists of the late 1920s, and many of the names associated prominently in Black American history. People like Claude McKay, Ralph Ellison, Marian Anderson, Julian Bond, W.E.B. Du Bois, Maya Angelou, and Langston Hughes were paid by the Rosenwald Foundation going all the way back to the 1920s. So these black figures were being marketed to the masses by a small group of Jewish men as the leading black scholars in the country. This very same Rosenwald Fund first conducted the degenerate syphilis study in 5 southern states, transpiring as a result of their initial blueprint in the Tuskegee experiments. In addition, the Julius Rosenwald Foundation is responsible for the construction of over 5,000 schools, most of these schools primarily built for Southern blacks. Why was Rosenwald so interested in helping black people? Rosenwald himself came from an immigrant family of Jewish merchants. As a young man, he learned the family trade as an apprentice in New York and began making clothes. This led to his partnership with Sears Roebuck, who allowed him to buy shares in the company after they were having financial trouble. The company revived under Rosenwald, and he became wealthy. Rosenwald, while working as a young man, developed a close friendship with Henry Goldman, another second-generation German Jew, who was best known for Goldman Sachs, a prime brokerage investment firm that his father Marcus founded in Bavaria, Germany. Rosenwald had other powerful friends as well, who would all be instrumental in helping him and people like him become the face of simulated social reform. These men would use their millions to champion the new black agenda. When tracing the money to some of the most prominent black organizations of the past, one is left with one very common denominator. This denominator is the deception behind the miseducation of the Negro, a history signed and sealed in an African slavery-connected identity delivered to you by ignorant or compromised Negroes who have been indoctrinated into a false dogmatic historical cover-up. When reading the words of black scholars of the past, there seems to be a romanticized relationship between these authors and their supposed African heritage. In W.E.B. Du Bois' renowned work, The Souls of Black Folk, The reference to Africa was made nearly a dozen times. In each reference, the word Africa or African is inserted into the text to draw a comparison by similarity between African and Black American culture. And consistently, in each case, Du Bois provides no credible historical background into the analytical significance of his comparison, but rather vague conjecture, leading the reader into biased presuppositions. In page 196, Du Bois makes a definitive statement. The social history of the Negro did not start in America. With just this statement alone, W.E.B. Du Bois threatens the historical credibility of his entire career of works. Understanding the original American was reclassified as African and Negro in the century prior to his birth is a reflection never echoed in his work. Furthermore, the reclassification of a people and lacking in acknowledgement of heritable indigenous rights is verifiable treachery. If Du Bois was a true historian, then he would have developed his own legitimate historical perspective and outline concerning the history of the so-called African American. Instead, his writings are the bougie Zionist propagated social commentaries of an uppity Negro. As someone who had completed an entire database in which he had gathered census information on Southern American plantation owners and slave statistics, Du Bois never dedicated any of his writings toward the indigenous American culture that existed on the continent prior to colonialism and its connection to blacks in America. If anything, Du Bois could have been an instrument of the first American black regional beef. Instead of East versus West Coast rappers, it was Northern versus Southern Negroes. In writings that allude to the Northern Negro as progressive and the Southern Negro as a peon or pauper. His work, however, doesn't come completely without historical legitimacy, but instead narrated from the perspective of an outsider or spectator. In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, on page 48, Du Bois makes quick reference to the mulatto immigrants from the West Indies who immigrated to the North, whom had demanded to be considered freemen on the basis that they would seek assimilation and amalgamation with the nation on terms with other men. One of the families implicated in his text was an ode to his own ancestry. In his own words, the Du Bois family of New Haven sought to be not as slaves and not as Negroes. To be accurate, Du Bois, as the name suggests, was not American or even African for that matter. He claimed African ancestry from his mother's side, but his mother's Burghardt lineage wasn't black. His mother's grandfather was apparently a West African slave, but the Burghardt lineage was definitely Anglo-Dutch. On his father's side was the lineage of French Huguenots. His father Alfred had immigrated from Haiti to New Haven. By many accounts, his father could have been of mixed race origin, as French Huguenots were often known to comprise of a mulatto class. But with this being said, Du Bois had no ancestral roots in America, as did the so-called Negroes whom had been inhabiting the land long before Eurasian contact. In fact, it wouldn't be until Du Bois was in college did he come face to face with the true plight of the Southern Negro. And accordingly, this was the first time in his life he had identified himself as being black.
David Levering Lewis, W.E.B. Du Bois?
Yes, he always insisted on that pronunciation. He did not like the Gallic pronunciation, though in his antecedents he was partly French.
Look at this nigga's lips. Look how tight this nigga's lips are. His rectum's probably tighter.
As I say decisively, Du Bois.
Did you ever meet him?
You know, I say in the acknowledgments that I did, and I realized when, after I finished a lot of research, that it had to be about 1947 when I was standing with my father on a college campus in Ohio. My father and Du Bois were acquaintances, if not friends, and Du Bois apparently approached and asked me what I intended to do with my life. And I was then about 9 years old. I could now tell him a good part of my life was taken up answering that question by writing the first of this 2-volume biography.
Why is this nigga talking like that? He gotta be Boule.
Who was he?
W.E.B. Du Bois was a man who lived about 95 years, and so his life really spans the 20th century and its issues and its major personalities. He was born in the north, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, a small town in the Berkshires, and educated elementary and high school there, and then attended college at Fisk University in Tennessee, and then took a second bachelor's at Harvard, and then went on to obtain the PhD in history from Harvard, the first African-American to be awarded the doctorate. And before he did that, he spent about 2 years at the University of Berlin.
University. Where is this nigga from? I gotta find out where this nigga's from. Look here, it says this nigga is from Arkansas. The Boule got them niggas on that straight Buckingham, bruh.
Taught here and there at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote a book called The Philadelphia Negro, which is one of the first books of urban sociology in America. And then he went on to Atlanta University, and for 10 years he superintended the really pioneering studies, the Atlanta University studies, which simply took the whole gamut of African American and Southern life. And then he retired from teaching to the activity of being editor of the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, from 1910 to 1934. And he was, of course, also a co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it was he who insisted that it be colored, not Negro, not African, not black, but colored, because he wanted the association indeed to have a mission and mandate which would address itself to the larger issue of darker peoples everywhere. He was always thinking a bit ahead of the administrators, bureaucrats, and colleagues for whom the immediate and pragmatic was more compelling.
Like, his lips are so tight. Talks like Dan Rather's bastard son.
Both verbally and in prose, he would espouse the position. But then a few years later, he might well strike up another position, which was not in direct contradistinction to the previous position, more than a shade different. And so many of his allies found themselves puzzled as in his long life he took a variety of positions that were somewhat paradoxical. Underneath them all, though, was a principled consistency that racism must be combated, that human rights must be affirmed, and that economic justice was the key to the eventual accomplishment of parity and the enhancement of the great majority of the life chances of peoples.
University. He's got to be one of the most bougie niggas I've ever seen in my life. The underlying aspect of the ascension of many of these men was the conflation of the African and black identity. While many of these men were mulattoes passing as white, and even several with non-indigenous American roots, it is a matter of fact, non-American blacks were at the forefront of black Hegelian deception in the early 20th century, as the quasi-leading voices of black America were tokens funded by Zionist, Jewish, first and second generation immigrants. Du Bois, although American-born, was the offspring of Anglo-Dutch French immigrants. His greatest adversary, Marcus Garvey, was a Jamaican-born immigrant who proposed the idea of American blacks going back to Africa as though the entire black population of America had been a product of the slave trade, as did Du Bois. but nothing could be further from the truth. Du Bois has been proclaimed a Pan-Africanist by modern historians. This he and Garvey shared in philosophy, but their ideologies concerning the methods for black improvement were in conflict. These two men had numerous public spats. Perhaps Du Bois is best known for his contribution in the founding of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But Du Bois wasn't the sole founder or source of funding for the NAACP. In truth, the NAACP was a predominantly Zionist white organization from its very inception. All of its officers, with the perverse hybrid exception of Du Bois, were either white abolitionists or Jewish, and Du Bois' role was merely as a public relations figurehead with no executive authority. The organization would go on to recruit several other Jewish leaders for pivotal roles within the organization. The NAACP would even recruit funds from Jacob Schiff, a German Jewish financier for the Rothschild family, whom had ironically funded communism and the Bolshevik Revolution. One of Schiff's major contentions with the Bolsheviks was their apparent anti-Semitism. But of course, the leaders of the Bolsheviks themselves were Jews. Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, even Stalin and Karl Marx had changed their names to conceal their Jewish identity and then posed as revolutionaries and anti-Semites before the world, funded by the propaganda machine that has now amalgamated itself into the NAACP. And this transmutation would not become more apparent than when Du Bois proclaims himself a communist. This was a direct result of his dealings with his Jewish contemporaries, who encouraged Du Bois endlessly to present anti-Semitism and racism under the same light. Although Du Bois was supposedly working for the advancement of black people, he was well insulated within the ranks of non-blacks as the face for their coercive pitches to the masses. To describe him as a Marxist would be an understatement. Even after the age of 90, Du Bois was still endorsing communism, such an un-African philosophy for a self-proclaimed Pan-Africanist. Willie found comfort around his fair-skinned counterparts, as he had done for his entire childhood, as many of the men of the Boule had been mulattoes, socially accepted as white, just as the founding members of Sigma Pi Phi, Henry Minton and Algernon B. Jackson. Passing for white was obviously a theme for the inaugural class of Sigma Pi Phi, resembling more of a mayonnaise convention than a society of strong black men. Henry McKee Minton, co-founder, was the son of a mixed-race Union colonel and slumlord, John McKee. McKee, a man who erected housing projects in Philadelphia for blacks migrating north after the Civil War. McKee became wealthy by exploiting black transplants to Philadelphia by exchanging deeds to their lands and property they owned in the South for rent vouchers in his Philadelphia housing projects. At the time of his death, John McKee was recognized as the wealthiest colored man in America, with over $4 million and over 4,000 acres of land scattered throughout different states. He only left $50 for each of his children in his will, however, while leaving the majority of his estate and wealth, over $2 million, to the Catholic Church, entrusting Archbishop Patrick John Ryan as the executor of his estate. However, the will was challenged, and as a result, his son Henry McKee Minton received $25,000, which would be just under $800,000 today. Henry, as a young man, attended the prestigious